talk in the series on reparations and a reparations framework for understanding systemic barriers to advancement and to equity. We are very lucky to have Irami Osei-Frimpong as our speaker today, and he will be introduced by Dr. Winfield. So I hope that you will learn a lot today. I know that I am eagerly looking forward to this presentation.
I think we need to be aware that in taking up a question like reparations and the underlying issues of equity and justice it involves, we can't afford to pander or to preach to the choir. Obviously, it revolves around questions of freedom and oppression, but it won't do to take the root of much thought that often reigns the academy, to the effect that we can take for granted freedom as a principle and see what follows in terms of applying it and working it through consistently, or alternately, taking for granted that we have a common set of moral intuitions and engage in what some have called reflective equilibrium to see what would be the consistent way of thinking about these moral intuitions that we accept. In all these cases, one really abandons the tribunal of reason. Now, admittedly, in dealing with reparations, we do need the empirical efforts of economists and historians to inform us of what has happened and how the institutions that exist are operating. But that doesn't tell us what those institutions should be or what are the standards of right and wrong that we need to invoke. And we are in a world which is not surprising in having this feature, where there are movements that completely deny the legitimacy of freedom and instead advance very different standards. We've seen recently how a resurgent Islamist movement reinstated slavery on a mass scale. We know that fascism is on the march in the United States and many other countries that aspire to democratic ideals, advancing the primacy of ancestry over freedom and responsibility. So we find ourselves in a position where we really have to invoke that most free of all disciplines, philosophy, which dares to take nothing for granted, which accepts no dogma, and for that very reason is in a position to deal with whether or not freedom has legitimacy and deal with the question of what it is. Now, I think we all know that philosophers are troublemakers. Philosophy departments that are not dominated by assassins of reason are hotbeds of trouble. And Irami is a troublemaker. I first encountered him on his podcast, The Funky Academic, which very much was concerned with thinking through freedom, why it is so important, and how we have to think about it. And he's pursuing his studies to inquire very deeply about these matters. And I'm happy to say that in choosing Irami, you have someone who I think will draw out in a no-holds-bar way the considerations that have to be dealt with if we want to consider both what reparations are due, to whom they are owed, what character they have, and what are the rights that are at stake. So I will turn over this event to Irami and look forward to hearing what he has to say.
Good. Well, thank you for your faith in me with respect to this big question. And it's not obvious. There are a few non-obvious aspects of reparations that I'm going to try to dive into rather quickly, but I think it'll lead to a very fruitful discussion, right? So there's a fundamental instability in the way that Black people can press their articulated rights in a nation where a good number of the electorate is not comfortable sharing power or extending rights to masses of Black people. The Dred Scott decision where Tanny said that, you know, white people have no, or Black people have no rights that white people are bound to respect, that means something, right? Because if you're not recognized as having rights, you're not really free, because rights are how freedom gets externalized into the world. And until you can give some sort of story about how the institutions that birthed that sensibility have been massively changed, and not just from like the legal standpoint, but a deeper question about like the cultural institutions, then it's not obvious that just saying that suddenly Black people have rights because we won a war and had a few Supreme Court decisions that go our way is going to do the work, right? So as it stands, reparations discourse is conventionally trained on making Black communities whole in a nation that's given to be captured from time to time by anti-Black sociopaths. And, you know, Dr. Bobby Wright, a psychologist out of the University of Chicago, he had it harder. He thought, you know, he just considered white people were like biologically determined to be colonizers. I'm less sympathetic. I think the country makes them sociopaths. I think that we have cultural institutions that inculcate a quality of sociopathology that's not easily managed. And if you think that's too hard, there's a fantastic I'm trying to do technology, right? So this was a YMCA. This was a YMCA brochure the year my mom was born, in 47, right? So that's 1947, a YMCA brochure in Michigan, right? Like I don't make this up. This isn't photoshopped. That's just America, right? Like the idea that you go from that to justice in under 2 generations without a huge intervention, cultural intervention is I think silly, right? So you have to understand that the people maybe some of the people in the videos, in the photo are still alive because it's not particularly that old. And this was in the YMCA brochure. And by the time you get into a YMCA brochure, like you've had like someone has taken pictures and there's been a committee that decided I want this picture, but not that picture. And like, this was just normalized America. So when I say that we culturally inculcate sociopaths, I don't know what else is the result of this kind of youth camp. Like, I don't know. I do not expect that you can go through this experience and come out with a healthy appreciation for Black dignity, or dignity in Black bodies or Black communities, right? So the question is, have our institutions changed in a way that's sufficient to account for how the institutions degraded entire populations? When I say institutions, I mean the way we think about families and the norms around churches and schools and what's taught and how. There was a philosopher at Yale, actually, Jason Stanley. I don't know if you guys have dealt with him anyway, but he came out with a nice little book called How Propaganda Works. And he says in liberal democracies, it's actually a little bit clever, because in an authoritarian state, you can just say, you have a minister of truth, this is what's going to happen, this is what's truth, this is what's right, this is what you believe. And that's just the state line, and that's just what it is, right? In a liberal democracy, it's a little bit ticklish. You have to omit strategically the truth about yourselves and your own commitments to injustice or justice, or how the functioning of the institutions work, right? So what is omitted in our institutional formation is a lot of the work that I think makes entire electorates unreliable partners in our democracy. And I'm going to go from the word partner to the word fraternity member, as in brotherhood, because I think that's an important concept that we're going to talk about now. So there was, good, I'm back. All right, so there was a movement a while ago called the French Revolution. You might have heard about it. It was in all the papers. And the motto that emerged from the movement was liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, it was made official after the Third Republic, and it all ended in guillotines, but still, it's currently in the Constitution because it's some work in the 20th century, and it's also the motto of Haiti. Now, liberty, equality, and fraternity is talked about in some ways in the US. We talk a good bit about liberty and equality, but fraternity gets short shrift in our national discourse. And it's going to be the crux of my topic here is that we can't actually have a functioning democracy without a semblance of fraternity. And it's a fraternity that's abstracted from biology, and it's a fraternity that I feel like liberal theorists usually try to cover under respect, but I think fraternity gets closer to what's going on. So I'm going to make a short argument for how fraternity figures into the structure of self-determination in a non-obvious way. And then a long argument about the conditions of how the conditions of fraternity need to be artificially created and sustained as part of any meaningful reparations program. So we talk about equality, and equality is always going to entail a sameness in some respects and a difference in others. Without that difference, people would not be merely equal, they would be identical. This identity would be a problem for liberty insofar as liberty entails the individual being able to self-select our ends and means, which would be different from other people who are equals, right? So in order to have liberty, you need an equality that can account for difference, right? So you need an arena for difference in order to enable a space for liberty, and you need a space for sameness in order to secure individuals against the predations that are attracted to inequalities that emerge through difference, right? So I need equality so that I'm not vulnerable to other people's liberty. Now the question becomes, how do we decide upon and establish the relevant similarities for equality that allows for the relevant differences required for liberty, right? We're equal insofar as we all, can vote. That's an important sameness. But we're free to vote for whomever or politically campaign for whomever we would choose, and that as a matter of our liberty. Now, how do we account for which differences matter and which sameness matters? That's the question for governance. That is what we do when that is a primary role of the work of governance. In what part must we secure our sameness, and what part are we allowed to be different from each other and win our individuality through that? This structure of governance can be given to us externally to our wills, in which, like, for example, when we play our parts in a sport, right? Professional basketball players play under guidelines that are dictated by the commissioner of basketball, right? So it's not as if they're not governing the game as they play it, right? But that's acting under given rules, under given governance. But if we're going to be self-determination, the determination of our equality and our liberty can't be by external forces. It can't be by a plantation owner. It can't be by a commissioner. It has to be by us. So we have to both participate as participants, but also decide the structures of that ground our equality and allow for our liberty. So for self-determination, the participants themselves need to determine the rules of their equality and liberty. And in this way, the pre-political condition for a politics of self-determination is fraternity, right? It's what allows us to get to a table to figure out how we are going to be codified as the same and which ways we are going to be allowed to be different and win our individuality and recognize each other as individuality. You need to get to the table, and fraternity is what gets you to the table. It allows people to establish the relevant spheres of sameness and the allowable difference for liberty. So that's the short argument for fraternity for self-determination. Now I'm going to give you 3 rather concrete scenarios to highlight the need for fraternity. Let us say, imagine people, gather around. Imagine that an alien ship docks on the Yale quad. That would be fantastic. I didn't know there were aliens. And then someone gives you, Marina, a crisp $100 bill and a video recorder to establish a rapport with the aliens. A crisp $100 bill and a video recorder, would you do it? You would do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay, well, some people wouldn't. Myself being one of them. I like a few thousand miles between me and aliens. Well, a lot of people wouldn't, because I don't know if they're going to treat me as a colleague. I don't know if they're going to treat me as a god. I don't know if they're going to treat me as a roach. I feel like there are a good number of Native Americans who wished that maybe they would have let the good people from, you know, Europe just kind of starve that first winter. So I don't know. There was no presumed brotherhood. What I do know is they are technologically superior in a way that is announced by the way they have managed to land a space shuttle in Yale's quad, and compared to us, who from time to time blow up a shuttle as it leaves from Earth's orbit. So I do know they have power. I do not know if they respect my impotence. I don't know if they think I'm charming. I want to send a robot, maybe a drone out to say hi to them. I would not take that. I would not take that crisp $100 bill to introduce myself to aliens. You are a bolder spirit than I. But because, like I said, there's no institution that governs both of us. I don't know if they think of me as a colleague or a roach or a god. And without that presumption of brotherhood, and and brotherhood comes with a symmetrical power, there can't be good co-determination, good faith co-determination or governance between our two bodies. And I think I almost rightfully presume that the aliens are basically dangerous. I think that's not I don't think that's an irresponsible presumption given the situation. How I know I treat ants. I know how I treat roaches. I know how I treat weeds. I don't know if they consider me a weed. So there is no brotherhood, there is no shared institution under which we can actually understand each other and like actually figure out the ways we are the same and the relevant ways we can be different. So
how do you establish that brotherhood if you're not willing to take that step and go into the quad? How do you actually start the process of discussing that brotherhood and making those connections if you aren't willing to approach the crazy aliens?
I don't know if they're crazy. I just know that I don't know if it's my job or like I draw lots maybe, or we take volunteers first. I say, are there any volunteers? And you volunteer and I say, thank you, while I'm waited at a remote location to see how it goes. Yeah, take volunteers. I respect your freedom. And a gumption. Maybe when you get back, I'll give you a medal. It'll be a very nice ceremony. I just know that maybe not. I don't need it to be me. So the second example that is even closer to the Black experience is a competitive poker game. There are many ways to be locked out of participating in this game. An organization can simply not allow you to play. No Negroes allowed. Or they can allow you to play, but with inequalities in wealth that you have relative to other players that puts you at a structural disadvantage. Then regardless of the intentions of the other players, their wealth ensures that they can take risks that you can't, and they can otherwise wait you out. They're functionally the bank. Right, so you're formally in the game, but functionally you're not doing the same thing that they're doing because they have relatively an infinite amount of wealth, right? And then there's a third way where you can be locked out of the game, where you join the game, you're allowed to join the game, you have a reasonable share of wealth, and then the moment you leave to go to the restroom, the other players conspire to take your wealth. Right, so you're in the game, you have the money, you have all of the material aspects that would allow you to play the game, but the moment you leave, they conspire to take your wealth. And you know what? It works because the game is premised on the people having a certain cultural disposition where they don't like form into cartels and collaborate to take my money. But if they do, they can. I mean, if they figure out how to do it, then like they'll just take my money. And then they'll say, well, we all started with the same amount of money in this game. We all played under the same rules. It's not your fault you went to go pee. And then we had designs. I'm sorry, like that's on you. And then I find out so now when I play poker as a Black man, I hold it in, which gives me gallstones, UTI. So like there are all these health issues that go along with playing with white people that are not obvious or not articulated part of the game in the rules. Because if I leave, they'll go in cahoots and take my money, right? So the conditions of the game depend on certain assumptions of individuality that were based, that are frustrated by a primordial bond between the other players of the game. Right now, Charles Mills is a philosopher at Northwestern now. I think he's still there. He makes a similar argument in his book, The Racial Contract, concerning how all of our social contract theories, that came from modern colonialists, were kind of steeped in a quality of colonialism that always presupposes a fellowship that is reserved for a certain class or race and gender, right? So like when Locke talks, he's talking about men. Even Rousseau's, I think it's clear. He's talking about guys, and it's assumed that other people do the work for the guys who really matter, right? So, so the business of extending this fellowship that white people have with each other to Black descendants of slaves is actually going to be a rather revolutionary intervention, right? So it's possible that a reparations a plan will, give us money that's adequate to the nation's wealth that was made off of Black bodies, but it still be siphoned away through, cartels and associations and combinations of white people who get together and figure out ways to siphon off wealth. We're still 13% in a majoritarian democracy. It's not that hard. Or it could just be violent, right? So we could have rights secured to us. I mean, honestly, going off script a little bit, but if you're Native American, like, why would you believe anything the U.S. government has to say? You would have to be naive. Even if they gave you a plan, like I would have to ask for more in order to pay for the legal fees and guns to protect it. It still wouldn't be secure wealth, because like everywhere in the United States, when white communities want something that Black communities have, they get it, right? So we saw this in Memphis. If you don't know about the Memphis riots in 1866, during Reconstruction, it's kind of a big deal. The Tulsa riots, the funniest, not the funniest, but the most charming I found, there's a picture of the Tulsa riots. The interview about the Tulsa riots I've seen is that, you talk to old Black people who are still alive during the Tulsa riots, they'll say like, we were in it for a while, but then the planes came, and that's when we really lost it. It's like we couldn't deal with the planes. So when it was just like people from the suburbs or outside of Greenwood in Tulsa who were trying to take our money, like burn down our businesses, I think we could have fought them off. But then the planes came. So there's this idea that you're not going to fight the state. If the state wants something, the state's going to get it in a powerful way when Black communities are at stake. Right, so there's Rosewood, there's Wilmington. I just found out about Wilmington a few months ago. If you don't know, because if you're like me up until a few months ago, Wilmington, North Carolina, town, significant Black population, probably a little bit over 50% or right around there. Somehow, after Reconstruction, but I believe before the 20th century, there is a few Black elected officials were duly elected, right? Like, maybe the mayor, maybe the vice mayor, a councilman or two, somewhat close to the representation of the city. They were duly elected. The next day after the votes were counted, there was a riot. 40 people were killed. All of the Black elected officers resigned and were ran out of town. And then the white officers that they beat were installed in their place. So like democracy worked until it was inconvenient to white power. Like you could talk to a lot of people, and that was prior to the 20th century. But you talk about urban renewal in the 50s and 60s, And like James Baldwin called it Negro removal. And I suspect that probably happened in New Haven. I know it happened in Athens here in Georgia, where, Black people had deeds, they had houses, and then the university decided it went in cahoots with the city, and then Black people were scooted out. Those are cute deeds you have. You got to go because we want to build a dorm, right? That happened in the 50s and 60s all over America. Right? And then you hear stories about Atlanta. During the Atlanta Olympics, it turns out some people were living in spaces where they wanted to build Olympic venues. So they were given pennies on the dollar and told to scoot. And we call it gentrification, but it's pretty much, I think, the story of what passes for Black rights, right? So my mom is from South Carolina. She moved out to California with the Great Migration, like a bunch of people in her generation. And I was born in California. I'm functionally priced out of California. So I'm in Athens, Georgia. I would like to live in Oakland, in Northern California. I think it's very nice there. The weather, I went to college up there. I think it's very nice, but I'm functionally priced out. So I'm always kind of moving. And so there's a question about how free you can be and self-determined. And I'm always moving on terms that are not strictly my own. It's not as bad as being an adjunct yet, but like it's something close. So you're always moving on terms that are not strictly your own. And all of the rights we have are provisional. Even the deeds you have are provisional. I'll tell you one last story about that. Apparently in Decatur, where Emory is, they're kind of playing a game where they're trying to, gentrify, whatever you want to call it, and allow more people who want to live in Decatur to live in Decatur. And there are Black people who've been living in Decatur for a few generations, and they want those people to scoot. So I have a friend who wanted to live in Decatur, whose family is from Decatur, living in her family house in Decatur, and she has a hard time paying property taxes every year. But she does a little dance with the property tax board where she calls them and they work out a deal, and she pays the deal over the course of the year, and it comes close. And she's been doing this for 10 years. But then 3 years ago, she did her yearly call to the property tax board to figure out, like, all right, so how are we going to make this work? Because I don't make a lot of money. I'm just a regular Black person in a Black person's job. And the taxes are kind of high now. And the Decatur tax board was like, no, you got to go. So like, that was it. That was like, and the sense, my friend told me, it was like somebody told them that white people called, they want their land back. You got to scoot now. Like, so you were always only holding it warm. Like all of your rights, all of your titles were only ever holding it warm until white people wanted it back. And then you scoot. So lastly, so those are two concrete scenarios. Lastly, I want to give you a situation of earnest money. So when you're buying a house, I don't know how many of you guys bought a house, but when you're buying a house, it conventionally takes a few weeks for the mortgage to clear and the requisite inspections to come. However, the seller must take the house off the market while the buyer is dotting the I's and crossing the T's for the property, right? So in order to address this situation, we've come up with earnest money as an artificial institution of brotherhood. It is a material support of good faith that is a fraction of what the house value is worth, but it's just enough to show the seller that the buyer goes forth in earnest. That the buyer goes forth in earnest. And that way, it still means that if the inspection is bad or something bad, the buyer can pull out, but this is a serious attempt, and you're not going to be punished for trusting me in going to the bank and trying to buy your house. And if the seller took the house off the market and the buyer just kind of left because the buyer got in a mood one day and left, then the seller would be punished for trusting the buyer and taking the house off the market. So the buyer gives, I think it's 3% earnest money to show they're serious about buying the house while they get the rest of the down payment and all of the other cash available. So the seller feels comfortable taking the house off the market while the buyer goes to the banks and gets the money. So the goal of the earnest money is to show the seriousness of future ventures. And this is the situation of Black Americans. like beyond material redress for extracted labor and imposed degradation, what kind of reparations are required so that Black Americans know that the US government is serious about not being captured by the anti-Black racism that intermittently erupts and reliably finds state aid when Black communities start to amass power? So this is where the talk begins in earnest with the question, what kind of cultural interventions on white cultural institutions, in addition to cash payment to Black cultural institutions and Black people, would show that the United States has given up its habit of capitulating to anti-Black racists? Like, and you can ask the same question with Native Americans. What would it take to tell them, like, no, really this time we're serious? Because without that, any money is still like defensive. Any money is provisional. Any institution is like, we're giving this now because we feel nice, but then once we feel insecure, like that same state, because we are a democracy. So that same state made up of these same people under different cultural institutions are going to use the full faith and the power of the government to take it back because, you know, we thought we were comfortable sharing power with you. But then, like, when you actually opened up your mouth and started doing things, we wanted to take it back. I'm sure there are lots of Black people who have worked in organizations that, you know, thought they were very good with diversity until you were a little bit too Black. And, or, you know, maybe if you're a woman, a little bit too much of a woman. And then they were like, why? Like, I didn't know they were going to make us nervous. Can we take that position back? So what kind of reparations will deal with that psychological element, that cultural element that shows like we're serious this time? No, really. Or is it going to be like Lucy with the football, you know, where Lucy says, no, Charlie Brown, I'll really hold the football this time. This time will be different. And then he's like, well, okay, Lucy, I'll trust you this time. And then, you know, that ends in tears for at least Charlie Brown, right? So what kind of cultural interventions? Because without this show of sincerity, any other kind of talk of reparations is provisional as the promise of reconstruction. I think there should be museums of white terrorism. Museums of white terror, they can be themed. Look, we have the Shoah Museum in LA. There are Holocaust museums. We need somebody needs to tell white people about themselves, and it should be curated by me or someone I train, right? So we need, everywhere there's a Confederate monument, there's probably some sort of horror story of like a slave grave, of a mass genocide nobody talks about, or a lynching that nobody talks about, or a ritual castration, which was also part of lynching that nobody talks about, which was kind of weird and kinky, and like they were selling balls in drugstores, they were pickling them, and like, so like these, lynching was the form of terrorism that was normalized in a way that we're not particularly comfortable with, well, not like exposing, but the institutions that normalize it culturally are still there, right? There's a great book called Behind the Mask of Chivalry about the Athens clan, because apparently Athens didn't burn all of their clan like all of the other clans did. And Nancy McLean, I'm pretty sure she's at Northwestern, she's a historian at Northwestern, went through the clan documents and like just kind of listed the institutions that from which the Klan, she went through the minutes and saw the institutions through which the Klan recruited. And it's all the same churches that are still in town, and it's all the same institutions that are still in town. And what are we going to do about that? Like, have they really gone through a deep theological transformation and change to a quality of liberation theology that would make Black people feel comfortable? No, it's the same church that their grandparents went and their grandparents went. Like, it's substantively the same theology that was very comfortable with Black people being occasionally terrorized by good Christians. So what does that mean as a cultural institution, and how can they be themed? I want white terrorism museums, where we tell the truth about white people to white people, and they can be like locally themed by different curators. I would like to do a yearly training for all of them. But it would have to be like, we have to tell the truth to white people. For example, in Oregon, right? So Oregon didn't allow Black people to buy property until 1926. And as you can imagine, 1926, not that long ago, all the good property was taken up, especially since Oregon became a state in 1968. So they were one of these states that didn't want to become a slave state, but they didn't want to deal with Negroes either. So they just didn't allow them to buy property. And they had anti-miscegenation laws on the books until the late 50s, early 60s. So you really can't just be Black in Oregon because like, it was a very precarious situation. But that's not taught in the schools. So I spent some time in Corvallis, and you ask people in Corvallis, Oregon, where Oregon State is, you ask people, why aren't there Black people in Oregon? They'll be like, well, I don't know, they just never settled here. It was a sundown state. It was, the whole state was a sundown state till 26, where you could buy property. But it's not as if in 26, when you could officially buy property, that real estate agents were like, oh yeah, well, we'll just go sell. No, real estate agents, there are no incentives for real estate agents to sell Black people property in Oregon, like until like 3 weeks ago. And now it's too expensive for Black people to buy. So what does that mean? And all of the wealth that is generated in Oregon, all that Nike money, all that Hewlett-Packard money, all that timber money that's generated in Oregon, like what does that look like for reparations? The Black people were just locked out of it. They were just locked out of it. We can't have that conversation with Oregonians because they don't know enough about themselves, right? All of the family money and the family land, like, so I think maybe, we should just get a part of Oregon. And I want to pick the part. I don't want them to pick the part. I want to pick the part. We should just get a part of Oregon. Like I want a part with infrastructure and internet, and like have an HBCU. It's just funded by the tax dollars we get, and with 13% of the population nationwide. But I think we should get like 22% of the taxes in Oregon, for the property state taxes in Oregon, just for like Blacktown, and like. We just haven't, like 22% of the property taxes in Oregon go to the city budget of this Black town. And that, like, what would reparations look like? We have to be kind of creative insofar as Oregonians are going to say like, well, I don't come from slave owners. Yeah, you don't come from slave owners because your people moved to a state and like that didn't allow Black people for reasons. Right? And the thing about poverty, like institutions don't die. This is what Hobbes knew. Institutions don't die like people do. So they just kind of stay on. So we need some sort of institutional account, especially since we live in a world with inheritances. And we live in a world where generational wealth stays in, and institutional wealth stays in the family and the institution and grows because of the stock market being what it is. And institutional poverty remains, right? We have, in this COVID, I'm watching, I had to lend my friend $1,000 to bury his mom, right? That's Black life. We don't get inheritance. We go into hock for funerals. What does that mean? And then contrast that with white life, where 1 out of every 7, nobody believes me when I say this, so I usually keep the graphic. Oh, and I do have it right here. So it looks like 1 out of every 7 white families. This is from the Washington Post. I don't make this up. 1 out of every 7 white families are now millionaires. And for Black families, it's 1 out of 50. A millionaire just doesn't look like what most people think it does. I think at Yale, it probably just looks like a kid in flip-flops and a t-shirt, right? Like that's just, what's the tuition? So you have to understand that $1 million is not a lot of money. These are, I'm at UGA, and I think it's probably like, a quarter of my undergrads. That's at UGA. It's a competitive school. And when the top 15% of the population is worth $1 million, that means at competitive schools, it's closer to like, not that. It's closer to, at a private school, I wouldn't be surprised if half your kids are, worth $1 million. Just, they don't know how much their parents are worth, but just with a house. And in California, that's just one house and like a condo, right? So like, and I don't know property value in New Haven, but we have to understand that this money is a lot of money, and an overwhelming amount when juxtaposed with Black poverty that's generational, right? So how do you prepare white people culturally? And this goes at the non-political institutions. how do you, because we're a democratic society, so we're actually working on the electorate. How do you work on the electorate so that they can honor Black rights claims, even when they're uncomfortable? And they'll allow Black rights claims to negate their entitlement, because you're not really free, you're not really autonomous or self-determining if you can't negate the aspirations of other people. Because if their aspirations include or involve you in any other way, and that means you need to be able to negate them, or you're just a tool for them, right? So what's it going to take for Black communities to be able to say no to Yale? Or like to say, actually, we want that land back. I don't know if Yale has taken Black land. I just kind of suspect it has. I know UGA has, and I know Berkeley has, and I know the University of Chicago. So all the institutions I've ever been affiliated with, like, you don't have to look too far for seeing that they've just kind of yoinked Black land when it was convenient. So like, what kind of cultural interventions would it take for them just to give that land back, and then not do it in the future when they want it, right? So that's kind of what, I'll open it up for questions now. But these are the kind of cultural interventions I talked to. We need to go after churches, and we need to go after schools, and we need to start changing curriculum. I will say that there is a program that I was amused with in Chicago, because they had a police chief by the name of Burgess. You might have heard about it. This hit about 5 years ago. He spent the 70s and the 80s like torturing Black defendants and extracting confessions out of them, which is a whole thing. But when he was finally found guilty about 5 years ago, they took him from his retirement boat in Florida and brought him to jail, and he quickly died. So he spent a few decades torturing Black people. But what they asked for in the settlement was that it's taught in Chicago public schools. So I appreciate that, right? So you need something like that. I shouldn't have found out about Wilmington a few months ago. It should, like, and like I said, like there needs to be like me in charge of this curriculum. There needs to be someone who's not worried about white feelings. And we need to start talking about teacher trainings, because teachers don't have the stomach for this. Your TFA teacher who got the job by being a very good student all the way through her suburb and on through Yale is not going to have the stomach to tell her kids, to make her kids feel bad. I will. Right? So you need teachers who are comfortable making the occasional white girl cry about, like, maybe their parents are racist and their grandparent, Mima, is a horrible person, and just as bad as Papa. So like, what you need, people who are actually going to have this kind of conversation with students doing the cultural work. And you need museums of white terrorism. I mean, we just need to be honest about this so that we kind of cultivate the quality of white electorate that will honor Black rights. Because left to their own devices, it'll be fine until it gets comfortable. Then they want what they want. And that's the story of America, white people wanting what they want. And I just, like, I don't want to take self-governance away and self-determination away, but that just means we need a better quality of electorate. So we need to start thinking of cultural interventions. A lot of people think you can do this through the courts, but I'm not. The courts, they don't have budgetary power nor executive authority. So pretty much, like, whatever they say, that doesn't really matter until the white people on the ground actually want it to matter. That's why you can desegregate schools with Brown versus Board of Education in 54, but Athens not get desegregated its schools until 71, because they didn't feel like it until then. And then they didn't feel like it until they had propped up enough segregation academies for it not to matter. Right? So it can't happen through the courts. I think the courts are a bad way to look at justice. We need to actually take the intervention to the streets, through the curriculum, through our organs of cultural production. And that is all for my talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you ready for questions?
Yes.
Awesome. Jane, do you want to start? You're muted.
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting and provocative, and I very much agree with your last comments about culture and making white kids cry. And I went to the lab school, and
Chicago?
yeah,
Oh, yeah.
And actually, some of our teachers did make us cry. And I think that that's a very good point. My question for you is, last week we heard quite a bit about people who are involved in ADOS, the American Descendants of Slavery movement, who seem to be quite focused on reparations in terms of people who are direct descendants of enslaved African Americans. And I thought their argument was very persuasive in terms of you kind of have to start somewhere. But my take-home message from you would seem to be more that the reparations have to be very broad, from the financial to the education. Am I taking your take home correctly?
Yeah, right. So I'm a huge fan of the ADOS movement because my dad is from Ghana. He was taught that you come to America, it's white supremacist, but it's an orderly white supremacy. So if you just treat them nice and like do your work, everything is cool, right? Like they'll let you survive, just don't poke the bear, right? So he's from Ghana, and that's what he was taught. And my mom's from South Carolina, and she was just chased around. She was just chased around. She was taught you just keep running, just run, and so there is a difference between the black people who like were brought over on boats on the bottom of ships, and then my dad who came over on a plane. So that is a difference, and it's a difference that apparently admissions officers know, because they get surprised with me because they think they're getting a nice like Ghanaian man, and it turns out they're like I'm like American black, so it's a little bit different. And I'm from California too, so that's even a little bit more dicey in their perspective, because we actually feel like we have entitlements. I feel very American, right? So admissions officers, Sandy Darity mentioned this, and he's actually a great guy if you want to bring him on. He's a wealth economics professor at Duke. And he mentioned this when he talks to admissions officers. He's like, yeah, they admit that they would rather have like the African immigrant, because that way they get, or the first generation African student, because that way they get the nice picture of the black guy, but don't have to like deal with black people issues. Because like if you're anything like my dad, you left your poor black relations at home, and it's not like back in Ghana. So it's not as if like the poorest Ghanaians are coming over to the US. So it's already culling. I think with Asian immigrants, it's even more like dicey, because in California, I saw a statistic where I think 50% of Chinese immigrants to the US have a college degree, and 2% of Chinese like population in China have a college degree. So if you just like, try to like extrapolate from the immigrant population to like what life is like in China, you'll get a hugely distorted view. And that's the same with extrapolating from the African immigrant population, or even Caribbean immigrant, or any black immigrant population, to like the slaves who've always been here. All right, so I'm a huge fan of ADOS, insofar as, even if it means that like I get to be in the back of the line, that's fine. That's fine. Because like I'll do fine, because like I have my dad as like a cultural influence. I think one thing that I can do, because I'm not scared of white people, is I feel comfortable taking the fight to white people. Because if you're not taking the fight to white people, and this is, I was actually with the founders of ADOS for a long time. But then I think there's a way in which they're scared. They can't talk to white people the way I'm talking to, the way you like every day talk to white people, because like there's still like a quality of terrorism that's working in the back of their mind. And there's also the sensibility that these people are sociopaths anyway. So let's just get ours and try to defend it with guns and more money. But I don't think you can defend against white people with guns and money. I think they always have access to more guns and money. They print money. So like you actually need to work on creating a better white electorate. But that's going to take work that might, it's going to hurt some feelings. I will say that it is funny that I got a few emails this summer with some of my old students, wherein they would say like, look, so I knew my parent was kind of racist, but now I'm like quarantining with them, and this George Floyd thing popped off. So they're like quarantining with their racist parents in the middle of like a quasi-racial rebellion. And like, that was a lot for them. It was a lot for them. So like, I don't know if therapists deal with that. I can't do everything, but that was like they're quarantining with their racist parents. And then they learn it from like their church. So it's like honor their parents, but what does it look like when your parent is awful? When race is the variable, like it's complicated issues that other people than I should work through.
We have a question in the chat, and that is, what strategies would you suggest for changing curriculum in K-12 and post-secondary education?
So all of the energy we put towards like the Supreme Court, I think should be channeled to like school boards and curriculum. This is what the right does very well. It's not an accident that all of these textbooks are written in Texas, right? So the right takes content very seriously. They take the content of freedom very seriously. And and that's why they have like Rush Limbaugh like on the radio 4 hours a day, and then after that Sean Hannity on for another 4 hours a day. They take the content of like what people think of as freedom very seriously. Liberals don't. They just think, oh, everyone will figure it out on their own. No, if they figure it out on their own, what they get is like diet. What they get is diet Republican or like vacuous theology, vacuous politics. And then when they're in a pinch, they just say like, well, I have to go to the white flight school because that's what everyone's doing. Like, so like that's what, like there isn't real content in liberal politics, almost by design. But so the left needs to actually get into the curriculum game. Like there should be liturgy for the entire liturgical year from like a racial justice perspective that actually does liberation theology. You can't replace like conservative Christian theology with like feckless liberal theology. That doesn't work. And so you need to come up with curriculum. You need to design curriculum in a serious way. You need to take school boards as seriously as we take congressional races, because then you get access to teachers and teacher training and superintendents, right? So, that's the kind of political sensibility that I would like, justice-minded people to take. We need to take curriculum seriously. Like therapy, like how much of white anxiety is held together indirectly by what they do to sustain race. I mean, I'm one of these guys who thinks gender norms are really about race, especially in white communities. And also like all of the anxiety around schools and housing, that's all race-based. So how do you deal with that in a responsible way without talking about race, which means we need to actually train therapists to talk about race better and understand political problems as actual political problems and not just private problems. I mean, at UGA, I think it's a little bit gross where these kids, a lot of them are depressed, a lot of the students are depressed, and they come in with like large political questions and questions about themselves and their depression and what that means. And what they're given is like an individual counselor, as opposed to like a political analysis to understand the structure of like what it means to be quarantined with a hugely racist parent who you don't want to tick off, and you're told not to tick off because it's impolite, and you definitely can't tick off grandparents because grandparents are rich and you need that inheritance. So like, what does that mean for your psychological well-being? And so like, we need to do something about these kind of churches. And we need to do something about, and then understand that that's America. And that's the milieu we live in. So we need to get in the curriculum game. And I think I think universities can do this. An entire K through 12 curriculum. The 1619 project is a drop in a bucket, but I want lobbying, changing what counts as American history for the AP test, right? That's the kind of work. Forget the Supreme Court. That's gone for a generation. This is the fight. And if you think the court was ever going to save Black people, then like you don't know too much about courts. Like the court was never going to save. The only people who go to the Supreme Court and expect justice are people who don't have real problems. because like that's just not the way the court's structured. Doesn't have budgetary power, doesn't have authority, like, yeah. So the court was never on your side. We need to take the fight to the culture and actually go at the institutions of self-determination in the US, and that's the legislature, and you do that by changing the electorate. You actually have to change the water.
Go ahead, Ruff.
Hey, hi, I'm a postdoc here. So I have a question for you.
Yes.
So what can we do? And by we, I mean in the context of we're a bunch of dorks or academics with research. Not just in the political sphere, but like, is there anything that you would like to see or people in your sphere would like to see from people like us who are supposed to do this like objective research, like mental health or, you know, like.
Well, we need to be honest about what the political antecedents of the mental health crisis in the United States, right? We need to be honest that these are not, we've privatized problems that are properly political problems, or at least have political antecedents that if we actually addressed, would the problems, we don't know if they would go away, but they would look markedly different than they do. Like how much of anxiety is driven by the fear of being treated like we treat Black people? More than we admit, because that's why we pick the suburban school we go to. That's why we make sure our sons and daughters go to the school they go to, because we know how deep the bottom is. And so like that drives a lot of anxiety and then it drives people to live meaningless lives because they're fueling this anxiety or make decisions and compromises that they're not supposed to make. So we can be honest about the political, like in psychology, I'm not a huge fan of psychology as it's practiced because I don't think there's enough content in your training about what freedom looks like to actually have these conversations with your clients. Like I haven't, like, now that I'm old, I suspected this for a long time, but now that I'm old enough to actually like know therapists, I am not heartened by the normative content. Some of the empirical content's not bad, but some of the normative content about what freedom would look like once it's realized and having that conversation and the willingness to have that conversation with clients. So, all right. So before you have that before you have that conversation with clients, right? We need to understand that I think there's something dubious about the model of therapy for racial justice because you need to have the clients come back every week, right? So I'm at a strategic advantage at like teaching a class because I can calibrate my syllabus to the ad drop date. Right? So like they can like me, and then like once the ad drop date like hits, they could have a horrible time, like leave crying and feeling bad about everything, about their life and about me as a professor, and then I could bring them back around before the end of the year. Right? I can work the room a little bit. You can't do that as a therapist because you need them to come back every week. So we need to be honest about what the market model does to therapy. And I wish psychologists were more honest about what the market model in therapy does. If you signed up people and actually led a movement to sign up people for 4-month sessions where they pay the first day, where you get the money up front, but you got them for 4 months, I think you could do better mental health work. I think so. Because you wouldn't have to like have them at the end of the session. It wouldn't be like a serial where at the end they need to want to come back. No, I don't. If you do this at a 4-month strategy, then you could leave with them not having to like you. So as academics, I would actually research what the market model of therapy does to mental health and how that might change the quality of service insofar as we can't deal with some of these thorny issues, because if the thorny issues provokes anxiety, then they won't come back. They'll go to the therapist who makes them feel good. So that's one thing. Two, like, let's be honest about the normative content of psychology. Like, how much of the training is just learning how to hold your head right and nod and say like, well, you're the expert on them. No, they're not the expert on them. This entire program has been like how white people are not the expert on themselves. They don't know what they need to know in order to be justice. So this whole idea that they're the expert on themselves, no, not yet, maybe. After a long time. But like I talk like this and a lot of white women go like, oh, that's horrible. What about self-determination? Well, it turns out you don't know what self-determination is because you don't understand it's not what people choose. It's like understanding that self-determination is also a product of the content that people have chosen and that people choose. And if the content's skewed, it's like saying that the vegetarian is self-determined when they choose between chicken and beef, right? So like you need actually a more robust normative understanding of what self-determination entails before you use that as an excuse to not actually do your job as therapists. So, and that's, and like there's just so many excuses. Well, you know, we need to build rapport with a client, so that's why we need them to like us. No, you just want them to come back next week. And like, and you're scared and you don't have the content to actually do your job. So it's all just a racket. So yeah, I think you guys are mostly participating in a racket that might actually be part of the mechanism that's sustaining injustice. But you know, you got A's all your life to do it. So who am I to say that you're in a racket, although I think you are. And you could expose the racket, because if the antecedents to mental health in America are driven by like some of the disconnects that we have about like race and some of the commitments that aren't realized, then like we need to actually explore them. And I don't know if that's really what you're trained to do. That hasn't been my experience with therapists I know. But you know, they can all hold their head and nod. So is that what I don't know.
There's a lot of training that goes into nodding.
There's a nod. I need to build rapport with the clients. I need to make them feel comfortable. Yeah, but that's always an excuse for not doing your job.
So let me ask you another question here from the chat, and that is, do you think that white people will ever truly sacrifice white privilege in order to even the playing field for, quote, minorities?
Right, give up I mean, do you think your client's going to come back when you tell them they don't want to hear something? Like really, I mean, I think that's a reasonable analog. If I tell my client something they don't want to hear, are they going to come back, and why wouldn't they? Or are they just going to go to someone who's going to tell them what they hear? If you can figure out that question, I think you can figure out like how to make white people actually earnest in their promises to Black communities, right? So like as it stands, we're not honest about, I mean, the mental health profession, I don't think is honest about what that liberalism of like, I can leave my therapist and go to another therapist does to therapy. Like, I don't think we're honest about what the entitlements of whiteness does to white people. In terms of like, they'll say that they're for justice. They might even write the check, but then when I use that check to fund a program that they don't like they'll use their power to take it back, right? So, I mean, I've been disinvited. I'm one of the most disinvited people like in America. I get invited because people think I'm interesting, and then they email around and talk around, and they're like, no. Have you heard what he says about feminism? Well, you know, Gloria Steinem worked for the CIA. Like, I didn't make that up. like, do I think it's counter-revolutionary? Yeah, I'm allowed to think that. Do I think women should have equal rights? Yes, I'm allowed to think that too, and I'm actually right on both counts. So, like, so like the idea that you have to give up the right to disinvite problematic Negroes is something that it's going to be a pill to swallow. Do I think they would do it voluntarily? No. Do I think they can be tricked into it? I wouldn't want to do it that way because I like coming at people like forward. But I think a critical mass, the good news is I have truth on my side, right? So like, I think a critical mass of truth tellers will make it déclassé to renege. And that's how you can do it. But you can only do it with a critical mass of truth tellers. We have to get rid of, but we have to get rid of a lot of entitlements, right? We have to get rid of the idea that like everything, the market model works for this kind of truth telling, or that people are the experts on themselves, because they're not. The Oregonians aren't even experts on themselves as Oregonians. And so like, we need to get rid of that and be honest about like what people need to know and the attitudinal barriers they're going to take to accept that. But I think once we are, a critical mass of the truth will get out there. And since it is the truth, like it'll be a good ground to stand on. But right now we're just scared to tell white people the truth about themselves. And that's why the museums of white terrorism, I think, are so important, because you could do that with just the truth. There are Friedman's bureaus all over the United States with documents about like these white people are terrorists. Please don't leave us. This is almost paraphrasing the Athens Friedman Bureau documents. the Freedmen's Bureau was the citadel that was established in a lot of these southern towns to make sure that after the Civil War, white people actually behaved. But they were pulled out in the 70s because northern whites lost the taste of ticking off southern whites, so they just pulled out the southern garrisons. But you look at these Freedmen's Bureau's documents, and there's a lot of letters that say, please don't leave, don't leave. If you leave, the moment you leave, these white people are going to turn into terrorists, and I'm scared for my life. They're like, letter after letter after letter is like that. And then what happens, the Freedmen's Bureau's left, and like the black communities, they were abandoned to the Klan. So we need to tell the truth about what that means. And once we tell the truth about what that means, we test the mettle of white people. But it's gonna go through a lot of tears and a lot of anxiety. And you're just gonna put your foot down and go right through that. And then we'll see what the problem looks like once all of the crying's gone.
There's a question that's directly related to that. And the question, or it starts with a statement. I like your white terrorism museum suggestion and terming it as such. But how do you propose they work? There seems to be a lack of connection or remorse in white people, unlike many Germans who, even without ancestral connection, feel sorrow for the Holocaust.
Well, they had a huge cultural intervention. They had a huge cultural intervention after World War II about like who they were. We had the South lost. Like, it's just as easily the case that the South could have won. They didn't have a huge cultural intervention about what kind of people are we that we were so comfortable with slavery. Like, they didn't audit their institutions. I would like an honest institutional audit of like families, of churches, of all these non-political institutions that allow, at the end of World War II, we made Japan give up their God Emperor. Like, we did that because we thought that the God Emperor is not going to actually work with a constitutional democracy, and we need Japan to be some sort of constitutional republic. So you're gonna have to give up your God Emperor. We didn't do that with the Southern Baptists. We didn't do that with the Mormons. The Mormons just found out black people were real people in 1978. I was alive. I was born in 77. So there's a way in which like we aren't really serious about doing the cultural audit to figure out what made anti-black racism so palatable. And so we need to do that fearless, isn't that what AA people talk about, the fearless inventory? We need to do that fearless inventory of our cultural institutions to find out how we are so good at reproducing white races in mass as an electorate. Because it's not like this is so bad because of Trump won. It shouldn't have been close, right? Like, it shouldn't have been close. And the fact that it was close means that like we're not close. And this, and it's not like we just never did the work. And the academics could lead in talking about the need to do the work and actually doing the work. And putting that truth out there. I mean, you guys could lobby ETS. Yale actually has the juice to do that. You could lobby ETS to change what's in the AP Psych exam, and I would like what's in the AP US History exam, what's in the AP English exam to change. Like, we need to change about our ideas about what constitutes an educated American. And I think that can happen. And I don't know if this is going to fix the problems, but I do know it'll reshape us enough so that we can have a different conversation. Because if every American 14-year-old had listened to the last hour of me talking, I think we would have a different nation. If it was just mandatory in history class where you like had to listen to this the way like I had to watch Ken Burns' The Civil War in 8th grade, then I think like there would be different arguments floating around.
That's a very fine point. There's just another comment in the chat that part of the lack of remorse seems to be a lack of education, which is really your point. I hear people say that we never owned a slave, but they may have benefited from the de jure segregation that allowed their parents or grandparents to own a home, obtain FHA and VA loans that were denied to many blacks, join unions and earn more and obtain certain positions.
Yeah, you never owned a slave, but you went to a segregation academy. I mean, like, so you're profiting. So what we did in the 30s, and even before that, we found a way to concentrate America's sin. And America's sin is anti-Black racism. We found a way to concentrate the risk and the degradation that goes with American sin onto Black people. So we made America's problem a Black problem while giving white people a holiday. We created lots of little Oregons. We, like in the suburbs, we gave them a holiday from America's problem. And so, yeah, it's easy to make money and it's easy to do well, even if you didn't own a slave, if you're living in a place where other people have eaten your risk. So we concentrate Black risk in the hood, and we insulate the suburbs from that risk, and these segregation academies from like actually having to deal with the degradation of dealing with descendants of slaves. And so that's still profiting off of the favorable conditions that we have created for non-Black Americans.
I really like your phrase that others have eaten our risk. That's a great phrase. And unfortunately, we're going to have to end on that because we're at 5 o'clock. But thank you very much for spending this time with us. I've really enjoyed it. So,
hey, you know, I'm going on the market soon. So like, if you know anybody in the philosophy department, you know.
Hang out. All right.
All right. Take care, guys.
Thank you so much.